Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Capitol Record. This is your host, David Bonson, and I am very excited to bring on yet another first-time guest this week, and that is Michael Matheson Miller, the Senior Research Fellow at the Acton Institute, also known as the director and producer of the phenomenal documentary Poverty, Inc. Michael is one of the great lecturers, scholars, thinkers, writers today focused on this idea of anthropology at the root of economics, an understanding of the human person. I forgive him for getting his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame as a USC Trojan, and yet, nevertheless, he most certainly is respected scholar, thinker, currently a distinguished fellow at the Bush School of Business at Catholic University in DC. I have been reading Michael for some time. I've seen films that he has helped to create. Recently shared the stage with him lecturing at the Acton Institute that we've talked about on this podcast a lot in the last couple of weeks. And I'm going to invite Michael on right now for a conversation about the human person in economics and so many of the things that we care about in our better understanding of free enterprise. And with that said, welcome to another Capitol Record podcast, and welcome to our first-time guest, Michael Matheson Miller. Michael, welcome to Capitol Record.
It's good to be with you, David. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, I'm really excited to have you. I kind of want to spend most of our time today talking about a theme that is near and dear to both of our hearts, something that you and I have kind of formulated much of our own economic worldview around, and that is the role of the human person in how we think about economics. But before we go there, I think it would be good for our listeners to know a little bit more about yourself, your background. I first got familiar with you out of the Acton Institute, but particularly out of Acton with your work on the Poverty, Inc. documentary. Can you tell us a little bit about your background as a filmmaker?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me on your show. So I'm a senior research fellow at the Acton Institute, which is a think tank, right? That, for the listeners who don't know, that does really looks at the intersection between moral philosophy and theology, religion on one side, and then economics, entrepreneurship, poverty on the other. And and as you said, David, focus on putting the person at the center of society and the economy, and so on. So my work there deals with a lot of different things. I focus especially on the philosophy of the person, but as you said, I've spent a lot of time over the last several years focusing on poverty in the developing world, and we did a number of projects. A project called Poverty Cure, which was to promote entrepreneurial solutions to poverty in the developing world, and then a six-part series for Christian audiences called Poverty Cure DVD series, and then a full-length documentary film for general audiences, and that's, as you referred to, as Poverty, Inc. And so Poverty, Inc. really challenges the dominant view of global humanitarianism and argues that poor people are not poor simply because they lack stuff, material goods. They're poor most of the time in the developing world because they're excluded from institutions of justice that would allow them to create prosperity in their own families and communities, and that the dominant model of charity has looked at poverty as an emergency model, like a hurricane. But that's not the problem; it's a chronic one, and that we've actually created the problem. But underlying that, which we could talk about here, is that there's philosophical errors, that they don't that we treat poor people like objects of our charity, objects of our pity, instead of treating them like the protagonists of their own story of development. And so that's the work there. And we're actually at Acton starting a new poverty initiative. We're going to be here in the next just a month. We're going to start working on the foundations of the kind of the key things we want to address, and working to begin on a new documentary to look at the American poverty, which is a very different situation than global poverty. And so that's my work. And then before I was at Acton, I taught philosophy and political science at a small Catholic college that had a branch campus in Nicaragua. So I lived there, and I lived in Japan for 5 years. I've spent time in Europe and other places, Africa. So that's a little bit about my background, but that's where I am at the Acton Institute right now.
So, in addition, a lot of the people that we could reference, I know that you are a fellow at the School of Business at Catholic University. Tim Bush,
Right.
who is a dear friend and client of mine, and has been a guest on the podcast before. And I think most of the names people associate with Acton Institute have at one time or another also been guests on the podcast. And so we have a lot of common friends, and our listeners are familiar with obviously Father Sirico and Jay Richards
Right.
and Anthony Bradley and a lot of good folks. And we need to get all the good ones on. Sam Gregg has been on. And so I'm probably a little late getting you on, but this, I got to
I know them all very
yeah,
well. I know them all well. So, well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
common friends and good company for you to be in. I think when you bring up the thesis that's behind Poverty Inc., it strikes me that it is a natural flow out of the view that the human person is the chief protagonist in economics. I believe that if I had the anthropological views that I have, that I know you to have, and there was no real poverty in the world or no epidemic of poverty. It just wasn't something we sat around thinking about. That everything was really just kind of focused on we're already in prosperity and now we want even more prosperity. That I would still feel the same way that the human person, their flourishing, their both material and spiritual well-being is vital to the concept of human flourishing, which is what our aim in economics ought to be. But when you add the reality of vulnerability, of impoverishment, of some of the horrid effects of the fall, and all of a sudden the whole existence of poverty and negative conditions enters the fray, it strikes me that there are some who double down on the idea of the human person being central in economics, which is what you and I do. And there are others that then, because of the existence of poverty, abandon the view that it becomes sort of so urgent that we alleviate poverty that we're going to forget about the human person to go help the human person. Do you think I'm framing this the right way? That I don't want to use pejorative terms like the bleeding hearts or folks like that, but those who have a more leftist orientation to economics, I believe a lot of them that they have a true and sincere care about poverty, and yet I'm convinced they're seeking to solve it in the wrong way. It seems that they are getting to the problem by abandoning the human person as central. They're running away from that thesis. Am I thinking about this the right way?
I mean, that's an interesting way to question it. I would say I think there's a couple things going on, and it also depends on what part of the reaction. So I think there are going to be people well intended who really value human life, who end up, I think, siding on this more kind of what you said left, but a kind of a technocratic approach. There are also just straight technocrats, right? Who care about the problem of poverty, but I think they're much more hyper technical. So here's how I would say that. I think that it's a good question. I think so. One is that you meant something really important at the beginning. Even if there wasn't poverty, the person still is at the center of the economy because economics is to serve the person and the family, right? Not the person to serve economics, right? We that the economy and providing goods and service and value creation is part of who we are as human beings, creative. We serve other people. We have social nature, and we can go into all that stuff. But
Is
that
this similar to Pope John Paul the Great's theme of the human person being the subject, not the object?
it's absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly right. So I think let's start there. Is that the human person is different from other things. So if you look around your room, you've got objects all around your room. But you're not an object, and I'm not an object. We're a subject. And by that, I want to say we don't mean subject of the king in that political sense, but a subject in the grammatical sense that I am an I, right? A capital I. And I'm in relationship with other people who are subjects, who have hopes and wants and fears and dreams, and who have agency, who have goals. And to treat another person who's a subject like a thing, like an object, right, is in a sense the fundamental error. Now you mentioned the fall, and I talk about this like sometimes if you look at, I think maybe the tragic line after the fall, right before Adam, when he's alone, he's dissatisfied, if you remember, and God puts him in a deep sleep. He names all the animals, remember, and he's
Mhm.
dissatisfied, and so God puts him in a deep sleep, and then creates Eve out of his rib and puts Eve in front of him and says, and Adam says, "At last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, at last." And so Adam sees a person like himself, right? And there's this call to communion. And from that call to communion comes another child who's willed for his or her own sake. And each person doesn't exist for someone else. Even the child doesn't exist for the parents, but they're willed for their own sake. And that's the intersubjective personalism, right? The person as a subject. Well, then the fall happens, and God says to Eve, "You shall desire your husband, and he will lord it over you." And there's a theologian who says what Adam first saw was identity and difference, right? But that after the fall, the difference overcomes the identity. And so instead of Adam seeing her as bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, he first sees her as woman, and then he starts to use her for his own pleasure gratification. Now, I would argue, David, with less gravity, okay? That's what we often do to poor people.
Mm.
We let the difference of their poverty, their ethnicity, their difficult situation, their foreign country. We let the difference come in front of their their subjective similarity to us, and we turn them into an object. And oftentimes we get emotional gratification for that. Okay, so if you bear with me for a second, so I think that's the object element. Right. So it's not it's as you said, I think a lot of times it's well intended. We're like, oh, these people are in a difficult situation, but we forget, well, but they're persons who are subjects who are in a difficult situation. Now you combine that with a certain sentimental charity that sees poverty as an emergency, like, oh my goodness, like think about maybe the first time you went to the developing world, right? You see dirt floors, leaky roofs, and you think, oh my goodness, like, why do I get to live in such a beautiful place and these people are so poor? And it's an emergency. Well, it's an emergency for us, David. It's not an emergency for them. It's a chronic problem of exclusion. But what happens instead is we take this emergency moment, that objectification turn, they get combined, and we think we've got to solve this problem. And of course, we live in a wonderful technological environment that makes us technocrats, and we think, oh, here's the problem. And so instead of actually saying, what do you need so that I can come alongside you, how can I help you so you can flourish, we kind of come in and say, oh, we're going to solve the problem of poverty. And so I think, as you say, I think for most, like 99% of people, they have good intentions, but those seemingly pedantic philosophical things, like, is the person a subject or an object? Is charity, what is charity? Is it different from humanitarianism? And we can talk about it, okay? But in short, charity is to seek the good of the other, which means you're not just thinking about their immediate comfort, but their long-term flourishing. And then how do we solve the problems of poverty? We tend to have this kind of objectifying the person, technical solution to a problem, instead of realizing, wait a minute, there are people like me, and if I were in poverty, what would I want? I would want access to be able to create prosperity in my own family. I don't want a technocrat from abroad to come and solve my problems.
So
Does that answer your question or
it
no?
does. I mean, it's an extraordinary answer, and I think there's a lot for people to chew on there. I really do believe that the theological foundation of this stuff is very important, and I thought over the years, when LBJ was pushing the sort of Great Society narrative and America decided to declare a war on poverty, now we look back 60 years later almost kind of smug about the fact, whether it's from a political theory or even just reinforcement of our economic presuppositions. We look at it as a failure because it has been, and we
Mhm.
can point to the different reasons why that may be, and it invites a cultural conversation on where certain values narratives have fallen short, and the whole idea of redistribution of wealth versus creation of wealth. There's a lot there, and I think all of it's legitimate, all of it's valid in this conversation about why the war on poverty's failed. But I don't know that we're going to get to the right place for solutions if we don't go all the way back to what you're
Yeah.
describing as the theological foundation, to where we want to start this discussion.
I actually agree with you completely because ultimately, it's like maybe your listeners are familiar with this, but I think for a lot of people, they'd be like, wait, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
But ultimately, these theological and philosophical foundations are what shape the rest of everything else. So, how we understand the human person, what kind of thing or being is the human person? What does it mean to be a human person? If we get this wrong, it's going to misunderstand. We're not going to understand how it's going to shape erroneously how we think about family, marriage, society, economics, politics, justice, a host of things. So these things absolutely matter. And I think that the theological question is important also because, especially when we're thinking about questions of helping the poor, we're thinking about broadly what we'll call charity. Now, why do we think it's good to help the poor? This is a question. Why do we think helping the poor is better than not helping the poor? Well, this idea is a theological idea that all human beings are created with equal. Like you think about, we just had July 4th, right? It's everyone's created equal, right? Well, where did that idea come from? That doesn't come from nature. That comes from the Hebrew Bible and the Christian tradition, that all people are created equal, and that we look at people and we think you should flourish. Why is flourishing better than non-flourishing? Well, again, these are deep theological questions, right? I mean, I don't want to get too deep here on a podcast, but these are deep theological questions, and I think you're hitting on. So now you say, okay, why should we help others who are in need? Well, this is the idea of charity. Well, what happened is that as secularism progressed, charity got hollowed out, and there was a secular version of charity, and that was humanitarianism. And humanitarianism is like has limited horizons. It stops at providing comfort and the material conditions of welfare, right? So I don't mean, when I by welfare, I don't mean aid to families with dependent children. I mean generally like someone's welfare, right? So the humanitarian stops and says, this is what matters: your physical situation, your physical comfort, your physical levels of health.
It's a
And if
it's
we
a
can just provide
conscious
those.
it's a consciously materialistic approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the letter of James, in the books of the New Testament, it says, right, you don't just give somebody, tell them about the good news and don't feed them, right? You have to do both. We're embodied persons, so though it matters, your physical conditions matter. But caritas, charity, says love is to seek the good of the other. Well, the good of the other includes physical welfare, but it also includes psychological welfare, mental, spiritual. It includes social flourishing. It includes independence and ability to use your agency to take care of your family and to create value for others. And it includes an eternal destiny. If you're a believer, you think, okay, your moral life matters. And what happened is humanitarianism, it just focuses on the physical. You combine that then with this kind of technocratic social engineering that we saw with the Great Society, that we saw with the big kind of plans of the World Bank and USAID, et cetera, in the developing world. And you have, I think, a mix of failed policies that just don't work, but also harmful policies that actually destroy human flourishing, break down families. I mean, look, you probably know this, but the United States government worked with the Indian government. We sterilized millions of Indian women because we figured, oh, if there's fewer people, they're going to have more material prosperity. Well, that's not even true.
No.
But even if it were true, right? This goes back to your earlier point. You still wouldn't do it because the human person is at the center of the economy. The economy is we don't get GDP. We don't eradicate people or suppress people for GDP. We don't enslave people for GDP. The Soviets and the Chinese, they can have productivity through slavery, but if we believe that the human being's at the center, we're not going to trade slavery for higher GDP.
And so we would
Okay?
we wouldn't go to those means, and as it turns out, we wouldn't even get the end because
Right.
they happen to be dead wrong that eliminating a generation of producers and consumers is allegedly good for economic well-being.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, so absolutely dead wrong. And what we're seeing now, and of course we talk about this at Acton, and you probably do on your show, is We're in demographic decline. We have a lot of problems. But one of the reasons, and if you want, this I always give this example. This is the kind of classic error. There's so many reasons behind why we make the errors on population control. Part of it is because you go to the developing world and you see a lot of poor children, and you think, oh, well, if there were fewer people, there'd be more stuff to go around. But that's, as you know, the zero-sum game fallacy that thinks of the economy as a pie and stagnant. And so what I'll often say when I'm like teaching, I'll say, okay, let's let's everybody take your money and pile it up in the middle of the room, and then we'll put the money there, and then we'll divide the room in half, and then we'll eradicate this side of the room, and now we'll redistribute the money. Is everybody richer? And the answer, of course, is yes, for a snapshot. But you've destroyed the productive capacity of the room. And so it ends up that controlling population just doesn't help. Plus, it's morally evil because it doesn't matter whether somebody's productive. That's not why their life value comes from. So the whole thing is, I think, disordered. So it's economic, anthropological, and theological. And I think you're dead right on that. So, but let me just to wrap this up is that. So I think that's this whole kind of great society approach. It takes charity in a hollowed out form in secular humanitarianism and combines with kind of a technocratic approach that we can solve the problems of poverty through levers of power instead of realizing what gets people out of poverty are flourishing lives of opportunity and access to justice. And then people they will create prosperity on their own. When I say on their own, I don't mean radical individualism. I mean groups of people will work together to solve problems in their communities without a technocrat somehow managing it from the top.
The National Review cruise is back this November. You can join us for a very special vacation. The National Review Institute is continuing National Review's 20-year tradition of memorable cruises, setting sail for 7 days in the Caribbean aboard the luxurious all-new Sky Princess. Enjoy fine dining, entertainment, and world-class accommodations as you rub elbows with NR personalities and other special guests during panel discussions, breakout sessions, exclusive 1955 society events, and more. Destinations include the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic. To register, visit nricruise.com. That's nricruise.com. Please check it out.
So they get the theology wrong, they get the philosophy wrong, they have the anthropology wrong, and then they get the policy wrong, unsurprisingly.
Right.
And necessarily have to defer to power, have to defer to central planning as a solution because they've already, both implicitly and explicitly, exterminated the human being from the equation. But I also want to be critical of the right a little bit here, because I kind of grew up believing in my, not so much my theological upbringing, which was very solid, but my political upbringing, that one of the great critiques of the welfare state was that it was unfair to hard workers, that hard workers were having to subsidize those who weren't working hard. And I don't disagree with that. But I think that what happened is, and I think this is true right now, that most critics of food stamps, of the basic things that exist in a sort of welfare state and kind of great society approach to poverty, most criticism of it is that it takes from people working to give to people not working, and that isn't fair. And I believe that we're missing the opportunity to point out, as you have done, the injustice being done to the person we're allegedly trying to help by stripping them of dignity, by stripping them of self-worth, by stripping them, we know Arthur Brooks talks about earned success. But also, and it was my favorite part in just the preview, the trailer of Poverty Inc., which the full documentary I've watched at least 5 times, but that idea about not just trying to create jobs for people, but help people become job creators. That there is this sort of fulfillment that a guy like me has realized. And why would someone like me now say my advocacy for the poor is going to cut them off from the things that I've found the most flourishing in my life? It strikes me as incredibly selfish.
Well, I think it's interesting. I'm glad you made this point. I think some of the right critics of the welfare state actually end up in the problem of individualism. And you've heard me talk enough, David, to probably know that I love Alexis de Tocqueville. And Alexis de Tocqueville, he warned us that individualism leads to centralization, and centralization exacerbates, encourages individualism. And so there's kind of an error both on that somehow in the individual alone is going to do this. What you really want instead is associations and communities of communities, because this limits the central state, but also empowers the individual, because think how you get things done, whether you're an entrepreneur or a political activist or a charity. You work with other people in associations where you have freedom to join together to solve problems, right? That's what a business is, right? That's what a nonprofit is, et cetera. And so I think one of the problems that the individual is like, wait a minute, you're just taking away from us. Well, I think we can argue we live in a community, and we're social nature. We have social nature, and we benefit from working together. And there are some things that we give to the government and some things that we do individually, et cetera. And I think it's just a false framing of the project. I don't want to go too deep into it, but I think there's a false framing. Let me just say, like, I think it denies complexity. Like, we do owe something with a social nature to people who are suffering, because we live in a community and we're social beings. And if, as Christians, we think that we have a responsibility to care for those who are in trouble. And whether the state's the best mechanism to do it, I don't think so, right? But if the state does some of it through redistribution, it's not fundamentally unjust. I mean, it could be unjust, right? But it's not intrinsically unjust, because we help each other out. We can create safety nets. Okay. So I think reframing the question of justice, not simply on a question of like simple individual fairness, I think is really important. But I agree with you. The biggest problem that we neglect is we do injustice to poor people because we deny them access to justice. So let's take the developing world, because we're talking about Poverty Inc. The biggest problem is the dominant system right now provides them, the developing world, okay, and the countries, with money and projects, etc. But what happens is the poverty industry and the recipient governments, the whole system creates incentives for the recipient governments not to build the institutions of justice and access that would actually allow poor people to flourish. So if you look at poor people who are getting all these poor countries that are getting all this money in aid, in some countries, 50-60% of the land has no clear title. It's very hard to get your court case heard. It's expensive and takes months or almost a year to register your business in the formal economy, right? So to participate in the formal economy, to get private property, to get your court case heard, you're excluded. And if you're poor, if you're a minority, if you're a woman, if you're a widow, or you're an orphan, it's even harder. And so there's one of the guys I interviewed.
You brought up the thing about title, and I don't want to ever let an opportunity to address DeSoto go. If you had $50 million burning a hole in your pocket, and you also had incredible resources and power and gift of persuasion, and you could pick between either dropping $50 million of food and shelter and goods and services into a country, or you could instead pick that you would be able to institute a form of title around real estate ownership and a sort of modernization of the way in which one assumes title around real estate, private property ownership. Which one of those two do you believe would be more impactful for poor people?
The second, no doubt, title and property to land, because
Amen.
So Doug Seebeck, who works at Partners Worldwide, he said, he was indoctrinated with this idea that, give a man a fish he eats for a day, teach a man to fish he eats for a lifetime. And he said, so, I was over there and I was helping Bangladeshi farmers and teaching them what to farm. And I realized these people know how to farm. They know how to fish. He said they lack access to the pond. And this was a moment when he realized, look, a lot of the problem is that we take access for granted. We take the institutions of justice, like clear title to land, for for granted. And this actually, if you don't mind, David, I think this goes even is related. It's a deeper philosophical, theological problem. But I think it's related to what you were saying even before about how to think about helping the poor and the injustice to the poor. We live in invisible complexity that gives us incredible opportunity that we think is normal.
Yeah.
And what happens, I think, is it makes us, on our side, when we have those opportunities, we can lack gratitude. And if we're unaware of it, it makes us have a technical view of the world that we think we can solve very complex problems with a couple of policy levers, because we don't know how actually complex and rich the cultural environment we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why your point of it's theological and philosophical at the bottom actually matters. So let's just super briefly think about how complex simple things are. So you and I are having this conversation. Okay, we're using Riverside FM, and we're the internet, and we're using different technological elements, and we're also speaking a language called English that we have shared inheritance of, and we're sitting in homes that are held up by wood and steel, and there's electricity, and there are electrical grids, and somebody made the electrical grids, and somebody maintains the electrical grids, right? And there's all this incredible layers of complexity. If I want to do a simple free exchange, you can start a business in 2 days in the United States, or 1 day in the United States, right? You can register your business, you can start selling, you can start buying. Why? Because you live in complexity with private property and rule of law and freedom of association, understanding of justice, etc. And it goes deep, actually, into linear concepts of time, the dignity of manual labor. Greeks and Romans, they don't believe that manual labor is good. Jews and Christians believe manual labor is good, right? Because we believe being is good, that God created the world, and we're told to complete creation. We believe that time is linear, that we're going somewhere, that we have something to do, that there's value. All these deep ideas of justice that come out of, say, Leviticus 19:16, right? That there should be impartiality and justice. This stuff seeps deep into our cultural life, and then we live as if it's no big deal. Now, if we tried to pay attention to it all the time, we'd of course go crazy. But if we forget it, then we think that all of this stuff happens, if it's no big deal. And so we did a project at the Acton Institute called The Wonder of Coffee. It's like a 25-minute film that talks about how complex it is to get one tiny little cup of espresso. And it takes thousands of people and parts and petroleum and shipment from multiple countries just to get a little cup of espresso.
It's
We didn't even
good.
talk about
It's good that we had to upgrade the iPencil concept to something more contemporary, like a cup of espresso. Yes,
that's right. Very, very contemporary. But the iPencil, which is great, we oftentimes think of iPencil as just an economic lesson. But it's actually a lesson, same with the coffee, The Wonder of Coffee. It's actually a lesson in the depth of complexity that we are relying upon. So what happens
which sounds like you're saying it's both an invisible hand theme, all the different moving parts that are kind of economic actors in exchange. But what you're pointing out is it also is the institutional and cultural depth that we can take for granted. We don't have to think about the fact that some of the things that are going on, the reason why there are fiber optic lines and there's broadband, and that there's a sort of ecosystem that is so fundamentally rooted, that has come out from something so fundamentally rooted in our way of life, that it enables us to take it for granted, along with invisible hand realities of economic exchange and so forth. So I'll let you keep going.
No, that's right. So I think what we oftentimes think about iPencil as, oh, it's the invisible hand, like no one's planning it. And I think it relates to like Hayek's knowledge question, right? There's just not enough. No one person could plan a pencil or a cup of coffee. And so just to reiterate, I think you exactly hit it right. We usually stop there, but actually it's really deep on the cultural, historical, and institutional and human side and theological side. There are all these things that create the ecosystem for us to flourish. Now, one of the problems with a lot of development experts and poverty experts is they're completely unaware of that. Okay. They don't know, like, there are so many people who think capitalism started in 1800. They don't know there was a medieval commercial revolution. They don't know they don't know that they're actually the rights of merchants are in the Magna Carta, right? I mean, they don't know the theological reflection. They don't know the influence of the Hebrew Bible or the books of the New Testament or the rabbis or the church fathers. I mean, they are unaware of it. It's like, oh, that's like superstition from the past, you know? And except they don't talk like Texans. They usually talk with a Harvard accent. However, but the problem is if you think that, and now you're a policy expert at an elite institution,
Yeah.
you think you can solve complex problems with like a little technical thing. So the now we get Hayek's knowledge problem is like hitting us pretty hard.
Yeah.
And so I think this is where taking seriously culture, anthropology, philosophy, theological understandings, and it doesn't mean that we always have to be there. But if we forget that and we take that for granted, we make lots of errors on the policy side. And I think you could say that generally speaking, the large social engineering projects of the 20th century, from evil ones like communism and Nazism to well-intended ones like the Great Society and the big kind of foreign aid project, have failed. Now, obviously, I'm not equating the evils of Nazism and communism with these things. What I'm saying is the social engineering ethos that we've won the war, we can win the peace, we can plan our way to solve the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death are just false. They don't work, and they end up harming people, and they do most harm to the very people we're supposed to help.
And
They
I
create
think that
injustice for the poor.
I think, to reiterate the point you made earlier, those things do not work, and that is empirically true, even if we don't fully understand why they don't work. But I do believe that we need the theological and philosophical to reveal to us why they haven't worked. And that even though I would agree with you, there's a moral delta, and a big one, between varying degrees of utopianism. The evils of communism are at a different scale morally than the evils of
Yes.
central planning. But
Yes.
I think they do both suffer from the same fatal conceit, to borrow from Hayek once again,
Mhm.
which is still this overconfidence in technocratic central planning, which I think comes from exactly how you've diagnosed it. Do you think, Michael, that there's a sense, we talk about the economic difference between Keynesianism and I proudly hold the label of a supply sider. Is there a sense in which the poverty cure that the left has proposed for the last 60 years is driven by some form of trying to get people to consume, to give them money so they can consume? Of course, base necessities are a bit different than John Maynard Keynes' idea of actually lifting aggregate demand through some sort of fiscal stimulus and things like that. But is there obsession with consumption versus the healthier obsession with production? Could you argue that even that is theological and not merely economic?
I think that's a very good question. So I'm going to be honest. I really want to have you come on my podcast so I can ask you that question, okay? Because you, I think, are going to have a better answer than I am, as far as especially thinking about consumption and production. But it is actually a question I have, and I'm thinking about. So I don't think I'm going to have a very good answer, but I do think the question is an important one. And I think a lot of it, there's something in Keynes, and with all the caveats that you've made, this idea of consumption to get us out, to get us kind of going, tends to be a short run problem. So if you think about what's the problem for poor people right now? They don't have enough food. Boom, here's the food. What's the poor people? They don't have enough clean water. Here's clean water. Okay. But the real problem for poor people is they're lacking access to the institutions that would enable them to do that themselves. So we talk about sustainability, but real sustainability means thinking long term. Now, Consumption is a short-term solution to a problem, whereas productivity is intergenerational. And I think I think there's an underlying theological philosophical problem with what you could broadly call a Keynesian philosophical attitude. Okay, I'm not talking about his detailed economic policy, and feel free to correct me if you think this doesn't apply. But because I'm not talking about his economics directly, as more as his philosophical view, which influences deeply his economics. He says in the long run we're all dead, and Keynes didn't have children. So if you think about it, there's two ways of thinking about it from a theological and a cultural point. If you have children, you're not just thinking about your own short period of life. You're thinking about intergenerational success and flourishing, and not just material success, but human flourishing.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes make a comparison between John Maynard Keynes and C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Because The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, remember that there's the magic and then there's the deeper magic.
Yeah.
That in the long run, we actually live forever.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a dual aspect of consumption that is, in a sense, just about the immediate, right? It's like, we got to solve the problem now. We're going to consume now. And we don't care about children because we don't have children. And we don't care about our moral life or our eternal life because that doesn't matter. But once you bring children and intergenerational thinking, a partnership between, as Burke says, the dead, the living, and the yet to be born, and then you think civilizationally, and you think that we have an eternal destiny and that we have a moral life and that we're free agents, this changes the way you think about it. And so I would argue, and I'm working this out, but I have friends who know a lot more about this than I, who say, look, inflation is both caused by decadence and it causes decadence. It causes short-term thinking. It causes promiscuity. It causes, consumption, live and drink, eat and drink, tomorrow we die, short kind of thinking. Whereas when you have sound, stable money and you're focused on productivity and all these things get together, this makes people think intergenerationally with hope and a vision of cultural success. I think these are super important. There's actually things David, I'm really starting to kind of think about more and trying to bring elements of my studies together, because I think your question is important. I don't know if I'm doing justice to the question, but I think something I want to learn about more. And if you have any reading lists for me, let me know.
Yeah, no, look, I appreciate that. I think you're doing a lot of justice to it. I think you're adding a whole nother richness to it. I would even add that I think sometimes there's an eschatological relevance that even within Christendom, who you would assume universally all people of the Christian faith believe in eternal destiny, believe in the desire for flourishing for their children and grandchildren. And yet I can see that if one believes that our endeavors in economic life are all about to end in a month or a year or a decade out of some sort of rapture fever scenario, that they have a very short-term view of history, that even then I would think that would have an impact in the way that they view wealth building, economic legacy, productivity, and things like that. I don't know as much as I ought about how Catholics interact with covenant theology. Myself being a Reformed Protestant, who holds Catholic social thought in extremely high regard, I would even add the adverb covenantally to the various things you were describing.
Mm-hmm.
That something
Yeah.
that like a secularist like John Maynard Keynes would be missing is
Mm-hmm.
it is not just that I love my own children and one day will love their children when they grow up and have some, but I really do believe in my theological tradition that covenantally there is this sort of multi-generational vision that is relevant to the Christian story, to the story of redemption, to God's plans in history. And I don't know of any theological reason that there would be a divide between Catholics and Protestants on that. I think that's something that is true for most in Christendom, this idea of God's purposes in history. And it ought to motivate economic thinking. It ought to inform economic thinking. And yet so I think you're on to something for a lot of different reasons as to where someone like Keynes could understandably be allured by the short-termism of consumption. What I don't think he gets a pass for, though, is missing the fact that even in the short-term fix, forget kids and grandkids, just within like the 30 days or 180 days of whatever period he's looking to solve for, that the sugar high ultimately goes away, and that you're left with the problem of needing productivity to allow people to consume, and that you're moving the ball around is somewhat smoke and mirror economics. In Keynes' defense, by the way, I still think that this is the biggest misnomer we're dealing with today. He really did believe in a fiscal countercyclical punch starting at a place of equilibrium in federal budget, not starting at a place of 30 trillion of debt. So I think in a lot of ways, Keynes would be horrified at Keynesianism practice today.
And didn't he also think like the highest marginal tax rate should be like 25% or something?
He did certainly believe in a very different approach about confiscation that way, because there was a lot of supply sideism. There's a lot of supply siders that would identify as Keynesians in that sense. That they would just simply view that incentives are going to help get that production going so we can get all this consumption going that we need.
Yeah.
Where my view would be, theologically, I want production to drive economic activity because I believe that's what God made mankind for. So it's a telos that is what production's for. But then, to borrow from the classical school, I just don't understand the notion of consumption being a driver, because I believe I have yet to meet a human ever in my life who needed to be motivated to consume. And I just think
that's the easy part.
Incentives need to be focused on the production side. It does seem to me there's a lot I believe within our theological convictions that 100% of the people God created were created to consume, and 100% were created to produce. Where I think the most common economic viewpoint today, even if it isn't self-aware or conscious, is that 100% were created to consume, but 51% were created to produce. And it really was Father Sirico who first enlightened me to this idea of we accept that wealth comes from producing more than we consume. And yet we are totally willing to deny that basic truism to half of humanity. And that being a great moral evil.
Yeah, I mean, as if somehow it's impossible. Like Theodore Dalrymple says in the film, like, are they somehow different from us?
Yeah.
And this is what I ask people. I mean, if you look, this goes back to what I was talking about with kind of embeddedness and complexity. Like, why do entrepreneurs emerge in some places and they don't in others? Well, if you start to look deeper, it's what you call an ecosystem, but it's this deep complexity of all these, of basically certain things that title, rule of law, et cetera, and the theological elements. Let me maybe pause for a second and go to the theological questions. I'm not an expert in Reformed theology, so I'm a papist, so Roman Catholic. So, but as far as covenantal, I mean, so we absolutely, I think there's a fundamental covenantal thinking. I mean, so the Catholics have sacraments, and sacraments are covenants, right? So we believe that the new terms of the covenant are the seven sacraments, right? So they're covenantal elements, and of course, as the Bible says, we are grafted onto the Jewish people, right? So the chosen people, and then God grafts us into them, and so we are part of a covenantal relationship with God. And in fact, I think it's an interesting point, because a friend of mine who's an Orthodox Jewish rabbi really stresses this point, like the covenant of God with man. Like, if there's no covenant, then man has to do absolutely everything himself. And so there's eschatological elements, not just in the Protestant side of say, the rapture, but there's also secular eschatological problems of the general idea of what Vogelin calls to immanentize, to bring into historical reality, the final times.
Yes.
We're going to create kingdom of heaven here on earth. And that's this kind of, so sometimes if you look at what's happening today, you have this technocracy, technocratic, the old towers of Babel were, the Roman Empire or Egypt, right, et cetera. And now, then, of course, the 20th century, you had the Nazis and the communists. Now it's transhumanism. The new Tower of Babel, I'm arguing, is man himself. We're gonna build bricks and make ourselves go to heaven, right? We're gonna live forever. And so you have this technocracy on one side to solve the problems of poverty, the problems of suffering and old age. And on the other side, there's nihilism, knocking at the door, consume, consume. There's nothing else to do but consume. And these are like two structures, and they're theological problems. And if you think about our economy and our political situation, we're in a theological struggle, right? And so I do think how you think about covenant and sacrament, and how you think about the world and production is super important, because it goes to this point, like what are I'm actually working on this new little project called Reframe. That's the working title. And I like 25 ideas that fundamentally shape like the way I think. And anyway, I was thinking, wait, what are they? I had read this guy who gave 50 ideas that shaped him, like the Pareto principle and Parkinson's law. I thought, well, what are the key ideas that shape me? And I like Pareto principle and Parkinson's law, great. But what are they? And I thought, being is good. The world is intelligible. Human beings are subjects and not objects. We're called the complete creation, right? And of course, like the law of non-contradiction holds, okay? But let's take those being is good. Like if you believe that being is good, which is a fundamental Jewish Christian view, that God created the world, he said, it's good. It's not an accident, right? We're not accidental. We're not the product of a demiurge, right? In Genesis, it's really clear, right? We stand out. The Hebrew Bible stands out from all the other ideas where, the world is made out of dragon's blood, or the world is made of the Greek demiurges, right? No, the world is made by God. It's created. We don't worship the world. They're not divine. They're just lamps hanging in the sky, and now the world's good. And we're put in the world, and we're told to have dominion over it and to complete creation, that we are supposed to participate with God to make this a better place. And that the world's intelligible, and we can do something, and we can accomplish things. Then, of course, I told you about earlier that manual labor is good, that study and manual labor are good. A lot of like medieval, sorry, maybe Renaissance too, but medieval is a little bit more commercial. There's a lot, and Renaissance too is commercial, but there's this kind of aristocratic idea that gets up among a European aristocrats, Catholic and Protestant, but Catholic, a lot of them are saying, oh, I can't do manual labor. That's a pagan idea. That's not a Jewish or a Catholic idea. That's paganism shaping us. If you look at the Jewish and the Catholic idea, right, before the Reformation and then after the Reformation continues, manual labor is good. Completing creation is good. Now, if you think that human beings are subjects, that we're created in the image of God, that being is good, that matter is good, that our bodies are good, that they're not an accident. We don't accidentally have our body that we need to escape from to upload ourselves, right? No. And that children are good, and families are good, and life is good. That's going to completely change the way you think about economics, because you're going to now thinking about productivity and that intergenerational success, and that all human beings are created to produce and do something to create values for others. That's a completely different way of seeing the world. I would argue that you're exactly right, that these theological questions are not simply pedantic. We're seeing them now in the way we think about inflation policy, in the way we think about spending, in the way we think about debt. Now, I'm not an expert in any of those things like you are, so that's why I want you to come on my podcast to talk about this. But we have just a minute. Can I ask you this question? I think you would agree with me on those fundamental theological, philosophical problems, or statements and presuppositions. It seems to me, David, if you think about our fiscal policy, our monetary policy, inflation, all the things, everything is somewhere between this transhumanist solution to the problems, and we're going to go off planet, or eat and drink, tomorrow we die, because nihilism's at the door. And all those fundamental ideas of being is good and the covenant, They are not at the table in Washington, New York, or Silicon Valley. What do you
No,
think?
and I agree 100%. And the thing I would add to your setup is that unfortunately, I think that's true of a lot of right wing secular economics as well.
Yes.
Randian
Yes.
thought is not doesn't have much of a leg up here.
Agreed.
In terms of the hedonism, the nihilism that you're describing, I think it's equally true in a sort of greed is good approach as well. That
Totally
only
agree.
where the human person is understood as the protagonist in creation, as a co-creator with God in terms of economic life, that those philosophical and theological precepts are necessary. And whether one falls on the right or left after that, with implementation, with execution, with their view of government or whatnot, they
Sure.
still end up going to the same place. Now, the question, I guess, is how we got here. Did this the sort of economic fallacies we live with now, where did they all come from? I still believe that secular humanism run amok has poisoned all of the above. Economics just becomes a symptom of the problem. Poor economic thinking or secular humanistic economic thinking did not cause all of this. Secular humanistic thinking caused the bad economics. And from that, I think a flawed understanding of relationship between government and people, a flawed view of family, a flawed understanding of morality. And I think we're just right now starting to wrap our arms around a lot of the consequences of this breakdown. um, it is roughly 100 years old. Since modernism ran its way through the church, and that I don't think there's been the prophetic voice in the public square in from those of us who believe in theological and philosophical commitments and truth claims. And so it's poisoned the academy, it's poisoned the arts, it's poisoned technology, and so forth. But I
You
guess
know,
go ahead, go ahead.
no, no. Oh, well, no, go ahead. And then I just, I think you made an important point, but go ahead. No, please finish. I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
The closing thought I have is a little more optimistic though. Is I'm feeling a a shift coming, that there is from those on the right who have been content to hold to a sort of sentimental understanding of economics, a general belief in economic liberty without seeing the person as the subject, without understanding creational economics, without fully appreciating all your points that you make about the human person. I'm sensing now a kind of post Randian, post Gordon Gekko, and post Reagan. But I don't mean it to be derogatory about Reagan. But I think there was a 1980s acceptance of markets because everything was going well.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think
So,
now it's becoming a bit more comprehensive. And I see that as a good thing if we do our job to really fully, I think, preach the holistic understanding of this subject.
yeah, I think there's a lot there that you address. I think that is really important. So one is this is the more practical. I think there's some good things going on the right with as you just said. I also think I'm worried about some of the things on the right with some more individualism and more kind of like almost like hyper reactionary stuff to the left. And then other parts of the, like there's new parts of the new right that are, I think, too technocratic, that want to create large industrial policies and have the kind of the state run the government. I think they're not taking seriously regulatory capture or human incentives. But I think so those are like things we could discuss, but I think the main point is like really important. There's a 20th century Italian philosopher named Augusto Del Noce, who was just recently translated into English by an Italian American physicist. And Del Noce is a genius. It's unbelievable. But he said something really important. He said, two points are related. In the 50s, you began to see a shift in the way the United States talked about resisting communism. It shifted from a Christian understanding, like, the communists are evil because of human goodness, and it began to switch to say, we're going to beat you in terms of productivity, liberation, and especially sexual liberation.
Mm.
And so what Del Noce, and then also this is Carlo Lanciolotti, who's his translator, explain is that what you actually had is the Marxian capitalism. Like, this is my language. It's Marxian. I don't mean Marxist capitalism. Like China, that's Marxist capitalism.
Yeah.
Okay, where it's like you can use the technical elements of capitalism, but use it in a state-controlled manner. It's like the Marxian values, the values of atheistic communism became our values. And then Del Noce said, in the 60s, capitalism broke itself away from the Christian traditional ethics that had restrained it. And so I think this is a big challenge for the right. It's a challenge for all of us, right? So what, like in the 1980s, kind of greed is good stuff, that make as much money as you can. The 1990s, the same thing. Like, why do you defend markets? Because we're going to beat the communists. Yeah, but if the person's at the center and families are being harmed and the moral culture is being harmed, and we're peddling pornography and cheap plastic stuff and food that makes you fat and makes you sick and all this stuff that makes people anxious, and the problems, of course, with big tech. I mean, you have what's the purpose of the economy? Well, the purpose of the economy is to serve families and persons. And I think this is going to take work on our side, those of us like you and I, David, who both, we don't have the exact same theological views, but we take Christian theology seriously. We think that limited government's really important. We think that opportunity for people, we think that generally spaces for free exchange where people can get together to solve problems and create opportunity for themselves is important, that religious liberty is important. So how do we think about the market? Where does the market fit? And I think some parts of the new right, I'm sympathetic with their cultural critiques. There's problems, but they, I think, end up going into a kind of a technocratic element that looks to the state to solve the problem. And I would say here's where Alexis de Tocqueville will work again, is just not just theoretical, but instructive. We need to rebuild communities. We need to strengthen the families, strengthen communities, strengthen civil associations. I think, and we need to build technologies, decentralized technologies, because you can't put all these things on hyper-centralized technology. I wrote a short little book about that because I think that's important too. And I think asking what you said, how, like, we can't just be reactionary to the left or the socialists. We can't just say, oh, well, it's not as bad as a socialist. Well, we have to actually make a case for markets that's rooted in human flourishing and a moral whole vision of the human person. And I think it's going to require work for us to do that. I don't know what you think about that.
I think you're right on everything you said. I believe it will take work, but I actually believe that the work will, we are going to animate people when we're asking them to do the work because of the cause of human flourishing, because we are going to benefit individuals and families, both materially and spiritually. There is incentive to doing the work. Where if we said, hey, we want you to join our cause, we would like to see higher GDP. We want you to join our cause. I want a new Ferrari. I'm for higher GDP, and I'm fine with people having their Ferraris. But the materialistic accumulation as the end of markets, of free enterprise, of capitalism, the word I swear I'm not going to use anymore, that isn't going to cut it, because not only is it not the full orb of what you and I believe in, people are going to have to do a lot more work because there's going to be a lot less people doing it, because it's not an incentivizing worldview. The worldview that we have is exciting. We're offering to a world that is alienated, isolated, polarized, looking desperately for purpose. We're offering something that contains purpose, that's rooted in creational economics and theological truth. So I'm excited for what we have to offer. But I just want to say quickly on when you talk about the quote unquote new right, I'm with you that I am sensitive to a point to some of their critique. However, I think that the challenge we have right now, there's a lot of strange bedfellow things going on
It's
where
complex.
yeah, where we not only have to get the solutions that we propose right, and I'm with you in critiquing their solutions. It sounds like what they're saying is we're unsatisfied with the way some of these things have played out, so therefore we would like to see the state do more for our cause than their cause. I don't accept it. But I also don't believe we can give away the store in granting them the premises that the liberal order is fundamentally the flaw here, that the notion of a free society and institutions that pluralistically allow some form of social cooperation, that they themselves are to blame. I want us to think God's thoughts after him, and for us to preach the entire ordinances of Scripture. And I believe that when we just go back to what we started this whole podcast talking about, when we start off with an understanding of the human person and build an economic system, the word market orthodoxy doesn't need to become an expletive, because all we're talking about is social cooperation, meeting human needs, other things like that. We didn't politicize that concept, and we haven't suggested turning it into a crony tool that helps Jeff Bezos and hurts the little guy. The kind of straw man that I think the new right is, quote unquote new right. I also don't want to allow them to be called the new right either, but we know who we're talking about here. I think that the people who are discontented with the notion of a liberal society are guilty not only of bad solutions, but a bad diagnosis of how we got here. And I think it's up to us to not only create the right solutions and propose right solutions, but to truly propose a more cogent understanding of what has gone wrong. And so there's just a lot of complexity to all this.
Yeah, I mean, super complex. I mean, I would say so. Just a quick response. This is probably a whole other podcast
Yeah.
on that topic, but I mean, I think so. Just briefly, I think that some parts of the new right, they have, I think, some valid concerns. There's real problems. I think they're worried about certain social and moral disintegration that's oftentimes justified through there's a market for it, and I like, there's a market for everything. There's a market for sex slaves. There's a market for organs. There's a market for a lot of things. Just because there's a market doesn't mean there should be market. Doesn't mean just because there's a market for something doesn't mean there should be one, right? There's a lot of things that are not meant to be sold in markets. Okay. And so that's not a problem. I agree with that. I also agree with some of their other like worries about some of the things that are going on in society.
But I think,
Um,
but the only reason I'm interrupting is not only do I agree with you and them that markets can't solve for those things, I don't know anyone who's ever said they can.
so right, okay. Now that's the thing is this is I think so. There's a couple things going on. So let's talk about that. I think one of the things they continually say is market fundamentalism, market fundamentalism, market fundamentalism. But I've kind of asked a little bit like, what do you mean by market fundamentalism? Like, does that mean there shouldn't be a market for anything? Like, and so for example, like I've asked this question, like if you and I, David, said, okay, we have a business idea, we're going to start a business. Do we need to go to the industrial policy czar and get the sign off to do it? I mean, is that what you mean? Like by having industrial policy and the state working with the economics, what does it mean to say a market fundamentalist? Do you think there's no realm for commutative justice? All right. And I mean that specifically. Commutative justice is the justice of exchange. Okay. So I'm Catholic. In the catechism, it's the foundation of justice called commutative justice. There's two kinds of justice, commutative and distributive.
Yeah.
All right. And we can go into that later, but a lot of these guys are Catholics too, by the way.
Yeah.
And so, like, are you saying that there's no realm in society for commutative justice, for justice of exchange? So let me go, I'll give like a 30-second summary of the two. So if I want to buy, we can see each other, and you have a lamp right there. I can see a lamp by you. Say, David, I'd like to buy your lamp. I'll pay you $500 for your lamp. And you say, no, it's 1,000. And I say, okay, $750. And we make a deal, and I give you the lamp, and I have the lamp, and I give you the $750. That's commutative justice. It's a justice of exchange, and there has to be some equality taking place. Now, it would be a violation of commutative justice if I said, David, I'll give you $5 for the lamp while I was holding a gun to your head.
Yeah.
And you say, oh, sure, that's not commutative justice. We did exchange, but you were forced in a certain way, okay? Then there's distributive justice. And distributive justice would be like in a family. So I have 7 children. I have an 8-year-old daughter. I don't say to her, you want dinner? Well, how much do you have money? Because the hamburger is $4.50. I'm like, no, I distribute to my children it's not commutative. Okay. One of the great errors we have, this goes to poverty, it goes to economics, is the misapplication of commutative and distributive justice. We take things that should be in commutative justice, and we try to do distributive justice. So Gary Becker, right, the famous economist, tried to apply commutative justice to the family by saying that some children are Cadillacs and some are Chevrolets, and you have to invest in the children. Like, no, it's just wrong. And so many reasons, but one of them is you're misapplying commutative justice and to a distributive justice situation. Okay. This is why, and I've talked about this before on my own podcast, I hate it when people say, oh, the family's socialist. No, the family is not socialist. The family is applying distributive justice properly. Okay. The church applies distributive justice. Okay. The state applies distributive justice. So, for example, if you and I are neighbors and my house gets torn by a hurricane and yours doesn't, the state's going to give me money and not you money. Why? Well, that's not unfair. It's because there's distributive justice, because we have like insurance in the state, etc. Right. So these are how these things work out. A lot of this is miscommunication. I think one of the errors on the new right is that they don't understand commutative justice and distributive justice correctly, and they're kind of misapplying them. And so what they do is they use the word market fundamentalism as really a pejorative, but it's more of a rhetorical tool. It's not an actual discussion, which is actually unfortunate, because it would be good to have a discussion, because they actually, I think, have some things to say, but they tend not to like to discuss. They tend to kind of make these points. One more thing I'd like to say briefly, and we could talk about this more, but I also think you're right, though. They have a problem in the liberal order, partially because it's super unclear what that means, right? It's just, and I've actually written a little bit about this, asking questions to some of their main spokesmen. Okay, you say this, could you explain? And I never get answers, all right? But like, it's not clear what they mean by the liberal order. Like, and I think one of the problems there, and I just talked about commutative and distributive justice, is they confuse or conflate neutrality and impartiality. All right.
Yep.
The liberal order is not neutral. The liberal order has very strong views that justice should be impartial. That's part of the liberal order. That's Jewish and Catholic and Protestant, right? That comes out of Leviticus 19:15. The idea of rule of law is developed early in like St. Thomas Aquinas, okay, and in the medieval period. I wrote an essay called 5 Things Christianity Brings to Our Understanding of Politics. And, one is that the state is not divine, that rule of law, private property, all these things that are part of the quote unquote liberal order actually develop out of the medieval commercial revolution. They develop out of the Magna Carta, about English common law, right? And of course, the influence of the Hebrew Bible and other things. And so what's the liberal order? What do you mean by the liberal order? And they're unclear. So the liberal order is stuff I don't like that happens in modernity. Okay,
well, and I would defend them on this front. I think part of the reason that the liberal order has become either confused or even something to be skeptical of is the way that humanists have used the liberal order as a means of sort of defending full-blown godlessness.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I'm with you on that. I think so. But the point is, this goes, but I'm responding to your diagnosis element. So like, if we're going to diagnose the problem, say that. Say, look, the way the liberal order is used today it generally defends godlessness. So like one of the key things that came up was whether drag queen story hours should be allowed. Okay.
Right.
I've published they should be prohibited. They're an injustice to children. Okay.
Yes.
It's an injustice to children to introduce them to disordered sexuality that could harm them and
Yes.
their life. It's unjust. Okay. So it should be prohibited. And law has a didactic power. Law teaches. And so, there's this is, by the way, speaking of a challenge to the kind of Randian or parts of the libertarian right, I think it's out of the Goldwater years where they said you can't legislate morality. Well, that's exactly what law is. It is the legislation of morality.
But
And
isn't that your point, that just like this word market fundamentalism, the phrase you can't legislate morality, things that are being codified that were only uttered for rhetorical benefit, that are somewhat meaningless until
yep,
they're unpacked, that I think they're doing more harm than good, because there's a lot of rhetorical punch in saying you can't legislate morality. But I have never had someone who said that to me tell me that they're opposed to laws against murder.
of course,
And I've asked them, do they not oppose murder for moral reasons?
of course, right,
So everybody believes in legislating morality. It's a meaningless expression, but
right.
I
Well,
guess
and it's also like market. This is maybe your point. Like we say, you're a market fundamentalist. Does that mean? And this has always been my question to the new right. Does that mean there's no place for commutative justice? It does a market fundamentalist mean that you can never have it, or does a market fundamentalist mean, which I think they want to say, but they're kind of going back and forth. It's like not everything should be determined by market value, and I agree with them completely. That's for sure. Like there are many things that are not determined by market value, and in fact, markets, the value of markets, the reason we have markets are not simply because they're efficient, right? The reason we have private, like I would say this, here's a way of thinking about this too. Private property, you're talking, like DeSoto and title and everything, right? And I make this case all the time. Even if private property were less economically efficient, I would still support it because it creates the space for families to live out their freedom and responsibility. It allows us to participate in completing creation, to be productive. And even if it were more efficient for the state to all own the property, it would not be worth it for human and social flourishing, right? And so the reason we have a market is not simply for GDP in this, or for Ferraris. We have a market because markets create space for people to work together to solve problems and build communities to serve others' needs and complete creation and a host of other things. And they play a good role in limiting state power and providing goods and services for people and different options and opportunities and education and giving the money for a tax base and for a commercial society. And there's a host of things going on. And I guess this all goes down to the question of, like, things are really complex. And so, like you said, they've left out a lot. Well, if you look at some of the big critiques of liberalism, they leave out Marx and Freud and Darwin. They leave out the New Frankfurt School of Marxism. They leave out the sexual revolution. They leave out a lot of things. It's not just simply liberalism. I think we need to spend a lot more time working on being more precise in our diagnosis. I make mistakes all the time, David. Okay, I'm not saying like
sure.
I'm the model. I'm just saying look, maybe we're getting off topic here, but part of the problem, of course, is you don't get YouTube views very often by like taking your time and making detailed distinctions. You get
Yeah.
YouTube views and Twitter clicks by being provocative. So, Marshall McLuhan says the medium is the message. Well, a lot of what's we're actually being driven by a technological viewpoint. And the irony, of course, is that some of the new right who are saying that we need to go back to traditional order are actually shaping their whole strategy based on modern Silicon Valley technical algorithms. But so anyway,
That's right. That's right. I think too, there's the political moment of Trumpism. There is a theological issue here because so much of this is sort of connected to this so-called Catholic integralism. There's a lot of overlap, but then some separations. One thing I'd encourage you to do, if other podcast listeners have heard, I've now done 2 parts of what will end up being a 3-part kind of debate, if you will, between myself and Orrin Cass on this very podcast. And our first one was on the subject of trade, and the second was on financial markets, and the third is going to be about labor, where again, he may fit into the box of some of the things we're talking about, but maybe not all.
Yeah, he's somewhere.
And yet it's a very civil conversation, and one that we've really worked hard to make sure there's a lot of mutual respect and fairness and civility in the way our discourse goes, yet also trying to unpack where there is genuine disagreement. And I think,
listen to that.
Yeah, I think it's been beneficial. It's been beneficial for me as a participant in the conversation, but many listeners have shared the same. Where I
Can
think
I say also one thing real quick? Just real
yeah,
quick.
please.
You know, and Orencast is actually interesting because I'm trying not to name names, not to be.
Yeah.
I just want to respect people, right?
I understand.
Look, we can get heated in this kind of stuff, and so like one thing I've just tried to do, David, and I'm not perfect, is to like I think we need to model discussion and debate, even though there's disagreement. Good Christians can disagree about a host of things. There's no single Christian political party we can disagree, and I think we need to work and disagree and be challenged. And I know I'm challenged by people on the right and the left who make me have to rethink my position. I'm too ideological, and I think it's important that we're not ideological. And we have to have a philosophical attitude to be open to reality and learning. So I'm not trying to I'm not saying names because I'm trying to be respectful. With Orencast, you brought him up, you know, it's interesting. Orencast, like I haven't read all of his book, but I read part of his book, and he'll sometimes use the term market fundamentalist, but then he thinks there's a space for the free market. So it's interesting. It's, you know, so I think a lot of it is getting past rhetoric and trying to understand each other. Like, one more thing is, you know, so I work for the Acton Institute, and some people will say, like, I actually met one of the guys on the NatCon guys, great guy. I was doing a debate, and we ended up talking, and he looked at me and he said, "Wait, are there more people like you at Acton?" I go, "Yeah, of course." He said, "Oh, I had a very different impression." So a lot of what kind of happens is we put each other in boxes to make our lives easier. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, like David, I gave a talk at the Acton University on cultural critiques of capitalism, where I went through some of the negatives in capitalism. And one of the professors, there was a professor there a business professor who had never, I think, heard me talk before, or maybe had only heard my person talk. And he raised his hand. He's like, "Look, I just don't think he's like, I agree with your critiques, but I don't think you give enough importance to the role that market economies play and value creation plays." You know, I started laughing. I was like, can you imagine if like that was tweeted out, like Michael Matheson Miller at the Acton Institute just doesn't think markets have, and, you know, business creates value for others, right? I mean, so these things are complex, and I think I'm glad you and Orencast are having those debates, because it's going to sharpen everybody to deal with really complex things. So it's great. So I'm going to listen to it. But anyway, sorry to jump in there, but I just think it's really important that we have these more complex discussions about very difficult things, instead of trying to get the next one-liner.
I agree 100%. And one of the things I've tried to point out, there's a certain frustration I'm having in the moment, because I don't know if you're familiar or not, my late father, but my dad was a Christian philosopher and public intellectual, and he was largely focused in the world of epistemology and apologetics. But he died very young, but his life's work was devoted to the subject of competing truth claims.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the ultimate commitment of a believer have to be maintained and applied in their life intellectually, and then also, you know, apologetically, defense of the faith, but also in the public square? And I have, and still do, desire this conversation that we're having with the quote unquote new right, different shapes and sizes of whether it's NatCon or Oren, or, you know, the integralists, all these different groups. I think there is complexity in a pluralistic society dealing with competing truth claims. And I think that there is a lack of thoroughness in how we synthesize the liberal order to competing truth claims. And I embrace the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way, it isn't just semantics. It isn't going to be at the end, okay, we all agree
Right.
but we're sort of focusing on this and you're focusing on that. There's going to be some substantive disagreements in either premises or conclusions or both.
Mm-hmm.
But I want us to have the conversation and work through it as a Christian community, because I'm convinced that we're going to come out of it better if we do have more conviction, more potency in what we're advocating for. And so if nothing else comes of this, that alone will be good to go through the process. But I also believe ultimately that it will not behoove us to cut off the thing that we need, because right now we're not happy with the people who are in charge. And the notion that instruments in a free society like markets or like free economic exchange, that we would critique something like that because we're discontent with some of the decisions people make with economic freedom. I would be very concerned with, on the other side of the philosophical discussion, if our conclusions end up being to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I'm hopeful that there will continue to be a growing remnant of those who are trying to hold all things out at once. I'm grateful for guys like Ryan Anderson, who I think Sam Gregg has done a great job holding these things in tension. What I don't want is for us to pretend that it's a problem that they're in tension.
Right.
Freedom in the marketplace, while there is still a fallen world, and while we want to advocate for strong moral individuals and families, those things are in tension. And I think we have to embrace that and then create tools and solutions and ideas around it.
Yeah. So I think two points. One is I agree with you. I think the way you articulate just like this competing truth claims that your father talked about. I mean, the reality is that I had a philosophy professor. He said, reality comes from God's mind, and philosophical language comes from our mind. And no one philosophical language is going to exhaust the fullness of reality. And, I think of two great medieval philosophers, Bonaventure and Thomas. They were contemporaries. They're doctors of the church. They're like geniuses, and they knew each other. And they had different views of the word nature. They had different views of epistemology. They had, and, and Thomas at the end, of his life in this famous famous story, he said, all my work is like straw. Because he had like a vision, and he realized, and he didn't mean it was bad. It just mean like like I'm not there. And so I think there needs to be a sense of humility that we're all going to be able to have this dialogue. And I think taking truth seriously, and then being able to say, okay, I'm wrong about this or right about this. So I think that's great, and I agree we need to do that better. And I mean, I'm trying to do that better myself, because I know I'm like sometimes like, no, you got to be more charitable. You got to be, got to work on it, because we all have our faults. On the second point, I think thinking about things in tension, it's really, it's exactly right. I mean, look, right now we have a problem. We have a market economy. We also have increasing or very high levels of individualism. Remember, for Tocqueville, individualism leads to centralization, which leads to soft despotism, and equality for Tocqueville leads to a level of comfort. So we have increasing individualism. We have high levels of political centralization. We have a mix between relativism and hedonism, and then technical utopianism. All right. We have the breakdown of the family. We have about 40% of people are raised without their father at this point. I think the numbers are generally, and higher in certain other communities. We have the rise of brand new technology that's highly addictive. We have 24-hour, in a sense, advertising culture. And we have a market economy. Like, things are going to go wrong. Okay. And so, but the question is, if you look at, say, I gave a talk on cultural critiques, and a lady, she was a Muslim lady, and she asked me I think from the UK, she said, isn't capitalism fundamentally about insatiability? Doesn't it just want us to get more and more and more? And I said, well, there is a part of consumption and scarcity that we always aren't going to want more. But capitalism is also about savings and investment. And if you if you're only thinking about insatiability, you're going to burn capitalism up. It's going to go away. You need to be thinking about savings and investment and long-term generational thinking. And so the point there is we have a culture and a political system that is encouraging the worst forms of market life. And so, but the answer, I think, is not to throw out market life. The answer is to say, okay, how are we going to mitigate the negative effects of markets? And I don't think the answer is to give all the power to the state. And I don't think the answer is to overly regulate the market, because that's going to create crony capitalism that's going to exclude the poor. And so I think the answer, which is not a very easy one, is we need to intentionally rebuild. I think we need to go to Tocqueville. He said, what kind of despotism is America going to have? It's going to have soft despotism. And this is what he said. This is the short version. I see a multitude of people circling around themselves, seeking after the petty and banal and vulgar pleasures with which they glut their souls. And above them stands the state. It regulates their interests, divides their inheritance. It would be like a father, but it doesn't want you to grow up. The people are like sheep without a shepherd. Well, that sounds like the market economy. That sounds like the world we live in right now. And he said there's three ways you fight that. You fight it with religion, local politics, and civil associations, private associations. And I think if we think about what do we need to do, we need stronger local politics. We need to go more decentralization. We got to get away from the central government doing everything. We need more power to not just the states, but to local governments. We need more people getting out and building civil associations,
mediating
solution.
institutions.
Exactly what Tocqueville calls intermediary institutions. Exactly. And those, so don't solve poverty and homelessness and drug addiction first with the federal government. Solve it with mediating institutions, the churches and everything. And then we need religion. And the facts are, look, life is hard. It's hard to make good decisions. It's hard to live well. And, you're going to submit to something. You're going to submit to propaganda. You're going to submit to the state. You're going to submit to your passions. You're going to submit to your own will. And as Lewis says in the Abolition Man, you'll ultimately submit then to nature, which means man has been abolished. Or, and this is why I talk with the religious part, you're going to submit to God. If you submit to Jesus, whose burden is easy and yoke is light. Is that right? I got that wrong. Yoke is light, burden is easy. Then in a sense, you're free. And when you're a free person and not a slave to your passions and not a slave to your own will, and you begin to have clarity of mind, now you're a person who's suited, a free person who's suited to be in the market and exchange things, because you're not simply a slave to your passions. And the reality is the market economy, it goes back to like Lord Acton. He says, liberty is the delicate fruit of a mature civilization.
Yeah.
And economic liberty, political liberty requires us to be mature. And we don't want to. All of us, we want to have our cake and eat it, right? No, you can either, if you eat the cake, it's gone, right? And this is, I think, this element of where we really need religious, civil, and local reform. And it sounds like it's not gonna, the new right's not gonna like that. They want a big technical policy. And I want to say one thing. I don't mean there shouldn't be better laws. I didn't say you can absolutely prohibit drag queen story hour. Okay. I didn't say that there should be no legal change. And if you don't mind, I'll make an advertisement for my podcast. I interviewed the well-regarded legal scholar Carter Sneed at Notre Dame, where we talk about law, legislation, morality, how to think about law and human dignity, and what kind of laws we should have that really respect and encourage people to take care of one another. And Sneed makes this point. Look, the dominant view of the human person is expressive individualism, that I can just do whatever I want, and I'm free to do with whatever I want with my life. And he said, look, if you want to live that way, I can't help you, but you should be nowhere near the law. And the only reason that people are able to have expressive individualism and do what they want is because somebody else didn't live that way. Because somebody else didn't simply follow their own passions, but actually took care of their children, took care of the elderly. And we want to create so we want law that respects the dignity of the human being. But we're not going to solve the fundamental problems of market economy and cultural breakdown through state action. We're going to solve it through, I think, this Tocquevillian model of religion, civil associations, and local politics.
Well, I'm going to let us conclude there, Michael. I agree with 100% of what you've said. I think that it may sound like more of a Protestant concept, but Kuyper's notion of sphere sovereignty is at play here. The idea of mediating institutions, the idea of strong families, of self-government, these are things that are embedded in the Judeo-Christian ethic that are deeply shared in our respective social thought, and are going to serve as a much more effective tool in what we're trying to remedy of the cultural problems of the day than attacking the concept of markets. But all of the above is going to be much easier to do and much more cogent when we root it in what we started our whole podcast talking about, which is that philosophy around the human person, the sort of theological truths that we believe about creation, about God's relationship to mankind, that he has created us with a soul, with an eternal destiny, with dignity, and that not only is our understanding of market orientation rooted in that, our understanding of mankind as a producer and a consumer, but also mankind's entire aim, a joy-seeking creature that exists in institutions, exists in this world in both a physical and spiritual dimension. And I think that when we start with that, we're going to end up having a common ground to accomplish a lot of things together.
Yeah, as I always say, we're embodied, embedded persons.
That's right.
And
Embodied
I
and
think
embedded. Yeah.
when you get this vision of the human person right, it doesn't give you a perfect solution, but at least puts you, I think, on the right track to be able to solve complex problems and promote human flourishing. Thanks for having me on your show, David.
Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you'll come back again.
I'd be delighted. Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, I guess that was probably a record for us in terms of the longest podcast that we have done. We just kind of kept going, and there wasn't really a point at which it made sense to stop. So I appreciate you bearing with us all the way to the end, and hopefully we scratched some itches for you in this lengthy discussion. It's important stuff. There are people right now that are bringing up criticisms of the market, and we want to be prepared and equipped to answer those, recognize where they're coming from. I think that in our formation and in our what I believe will be multi-generational defense of the concept of a free and virtuous society, I'll repeat what Michael and I both repeated to each other many times in the last hour and a half. We are going to have to root it theologically and philosophically, or it won't fly. So with that said, thank you for listening once again to the Capitol Record. We'll look forward to being with you again next week.